let's start with September 11th, because I think really that seems to be where things changed. Tell me about who David Solway was before 9/11 and then after.
The ideological disaster from which we are suffering today in the West derives almost linearly from the 1960s. In a sense, we have never grown up. This is who I was then before 9/11. Voting NDP, reading Chomsky with approval, being duly anti-American because all my friends and all my colleagues were anti-American. I was pro-Palestinian, even though I'm Jewish. I was Isaac Deutscher's telling phrase, I was a non-Jewish Jew, I had no Jewish upbringing, therefore I was anti-Zionist, I was anti-Israeli, anti-corporatist. You know, John Ralston Saul would have loved me back at that time. You know, that's who I was, and so were my friends, because we all came through the same, what I call, the same Arcadian jacuzzi. That's what the 60s were. You know? 9/11 changed everything, for me at any rate. I was on a Greek island, as I describe it in the preface of my book, and I was looking, and this is interesting, I was looking at a television screen over the bar where I was having coffee in the morning, and I saw this, what I thought was a film, a second-rate war movie, planes crashing into office towers, bodies plummeting to the ground, smoke and fire everywhere, and I thought this is another typical, you know, second-rate Hollywood production. But then it repeated itself as if it were snarled in an endless loop. And I thought, well, this must be some sort of defect on the Greek television, because that happens very often in Greece. And then an announcer came on the screen, appeared on the screen and said in Greek what had happened. And I realized that I had suddenly been transferred, so to speak, almost telepathically from one world to another world. That is to say, from the world of the movie to the world of the real. And it struck me then that this, because perhaps of my training, that this was also a metaphorical correlate of what was happening not only in the world but to me. I had lived in a movie up to 9/11. The movie was called, you know, leftist ideology. The movie was called The Flower Children Growing Up. Whatever you want to call it. We were living in a movie, essentially. Why? Not only because we were educated in the 60s, but because we were living through, all of us really, the most privileged moment probably in Western history, where from the Korean War to 2001, there were no seriously catastrophic wars. There were wars everywhere. There was a Vietnam War, there were wars here and there, we know that, but there was nothing like the First World War. There was nothing like the Second World War with its 60 million dead. We had no conscription. You know, I wasn't going off to fight. My children weren't going off to fight. They didn't have to even join the army. In Switzerland, you have to join the army, but here there was no mandatory conscription. We were living through one of the idyllic periods in Western history. So when you put all that together, you see, the time, the context, the historical context which we and our children were living through, plus the educational parameters that we had taken aboard, so to speak, through the 60s, naturally, we were just, in a sense, aging flower children. You know, maybe the flowers weren't quite so bright anymore. Now we can ask with Peter, Paul, and Mary, where have all the flowers gone? We know where they have gone now. 9/11 destroyed the garden for us. 9/11 absolutely brutalized the orchard in which we were living, or many of us. So that was the change for me. I moved from the movie of my previous life to the reality of post-9/11, the life I am living now. Just as on the screen, what I thought was a movie turned out to be something that was actually happening in the world almost at that moment.
It's very, very well researched. I mean, it's very dense in citing things all over the place.
That was my job. That was my education. This book represents the only university degree, so to speak, that I honor. I have 5 university degrees and they don't mean anything to me. You know, when people call me Dr. Solway, I look around to see who they might be addressing, because I don't, you know, these degrees don't mean anything. I call them in the book mere alphabetical excrescences. They don't mean anything. The only degree that, for me, is of any importance now, and it justifies me, I hope, to some extent, is this book, because I worked harder at this book than I did at my doctorate. 2 years into the writing of this book, then I also began to feel deeply uncomfortable, because I saw that my research was taking me not to the right or to the left. I didn't want to use these terms personally, though I used them in the book because I had to. I was moving towards something that I wanted to recognize as truth, Now, I understand as well that there is a certain truth to Pontius Pilate's what is truth, you know. We will never approximate the whole truth. We can only approximate some degree of credible verisimilitude. But at least that is something. So that's how I was moving, and I was resenting it and resisting it. There were times when I'd throw my pen down, because I write by hand, literally throw my pen down, you know, throw the papers off the table, because I was coming to conclusions that I had been educated to reject, you see. And then I would think, I've got to go through with this. I've got to read this book, that book. I found that, I researched Chomsky. I went through his footnotes. I realized that the guy was a liar. He really is, and that's why I called him in the book. As a Jew, I can say this. I said he is the Bobby Fischer of the intellectual world, another highly intelligent, over-specialized Jew who's gone round the bend. You see, I can say that being a Jew, but it's true. And after 3 years or so, the third year, I realized that I would have to change, that I could not honestly resist the conclusions that I was coming to, because the documentation that I had, the years I put into this told me that I had been wrong before, that before I had not known anything.
You're going to get a lot of flack for this book.
I'm losing friends right now.
The book is The Big Lie on Terror, Antisemitism and Identity. I'm speaking with the author, David Solway, and The Big Lie, published by Lester Mason and Begg, distributed in Canada by Random House.